being here with us for our NCACES webinar. My name is Victoria Kress, and I am this year's president of NCACES, and we're so excited to have you here. This webinar is part of a webinar series that we're doing this year. If you haven't already seen, please go to our website and take a look at the other webinars we'll be offering. We'll be doing 10 free webinars for our members. All will be providing continuing education units. And we're really excited about the topics. It's a variety of topics on contemporary issues. And we have amazing speakers from our region who are going to be talking to you about so many different things. Before we get started, I just want to share some housekeeping business. For those of you who will be receiving CEs, in order to ensure that you get CEs for today's session, please make sure that you stay for the whole session. We'll have a Q&A for about 10 minutes at the end of the hour. And for those of you who are present for the 60 minutes, you'll receive a short survey via email to complete, and you will then receive an email CE certificate, but that may take about 1 to 2 weeks. So please be patient as we process that. As I mentioned, please take a look at our website to see all the other great webinars we'll be offering for free to you over the year. And I also want to encourage all of you to sign up for the NCACES social media accounts. We have a Facebook page now in addition to our Facebook group, so please follow that. We have very few people following it, but we're posting important information there related to conference submissions, which we hope to get out by about December 1st. We can't control all of that, but I'm hoping December 1st we'll be getting the call out. Our conference will be in Omaha, Nebraska, the last weekend of September next year. So the last weekend of September in 2022, Omaha, Nebraska. So please mark your calendars and plan to submit, and please plan to join us there. We've negotiated outstanding rates. We're staying at an embassy suite, so the rate will also include free breakfast, a free happy hour, and embassy suites. They're all suites, very nice hotel. The area that we're staying in is downtown. It's very charming. There's brick streets, there's old-fashioned candy shops, all kinds of really great restaurants in walking distance from the hotel. So we hope to see you there. Please also notice we have a logo now. So again, if you follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter, just look for our new logo. And please be sure to like us and follow us so that we can stay in contact with you about important updates. I also want to mention that right now we have a call out for elected leadership positions. So we are looking for a president-elect, member at large, and graduate student representative. So we have a number of different positions that we hope that you'll consider applying for, because we would love to have you as part of our NCACES leadership team. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenters, and it truly is a pleasure to introduce both of them. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Cassie Storlie. She is a professor, and she's the doctoral program coordinator at Kent State University. I've known Dr. Storlie for a very long time. I don't even know, over a decade, I imagine. And it's been such a joy to watch her grow into this profession and become an amazing leader and contributor to our profession in so many ways. She's also a past NCACES president, and she has been involved with CSI, ACA at the state, regional, and national, international level in so many different roles. I couldn't even list them all there. She commonly teaches classes on diagnosis and research methods and qualitative interviewing. She's also currently the ACES secretary and the associate editor for the Journal of Counselor Leadership and Advocacy. She's received so many different awards related to diversity initiatives, the Kent State Scholar of the Month Award, and the Distinguished Faculty Researcher Award at Kent State University. She has been funded by the Martha Holden Jennings Foundation for the past 7 years for her interdisciplinary work in career development and science education with the Latinx population. And she was the primary editor of the newly published Counseling Leaders and Advocates, Strengthening the Future of the Profession book, which I've had an opportunity to review, and it's a really nice contribution to our professional counseling literature. Next, I'd like to introduce Laura Dunson, who is a counselor in Cleveland, Ohio, where I live. She is amazing. She is our webinar series coordinator. She is right now serving as the interim coordinator for our continuing education program. She's also serving on our board as a graduate student representative. She is involved in so many ways in NCACES, and I keep saying she's really been my right hand this year, and NCACES would not look half as good as it does if it were not for her and her tireless service efforts. Laura is an outstanding counselor, and she works with a variety of different populations here in the Cleveland area. She works with clients experiencing gender-based violence and trauma, clients within the criminal justice system, and neurodiverse clients as well. She's researches sociocultural factors that impact counseling. She's particularly interested in issues of power, culturally informed diagnosis, and the relationship between mental health and the media. And right now she is finishing up her PhD at Kent State University with Dr. Storlie. And we are so excited to have both of our presenters here today. Before you all came on, we were talking about this issue of diagnosis. You know, in our profession, I know we often shy away from this, but it's so important that we figure out how to use it and use it well, and that we have more conversations about how to do that. As much as we may not like a medical model, it isn't going anywhere. I can't imagine there's ever going to be a time that insurance companies will just pay us because they really get the inherent value of the connection and the relationship in counseling and how important this is. You know, we have to give diagnosis to do these treatment plans. It's always going to be that way. And what I love about the work that Dr. Storlie and Laura are doing is that they're putting a spotlight on how we can have these conversations and make sure that we do no harm as we're diagnosing. So I am so grateful to have them here today. And with that, I will stop talking and let them take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kress, and thank you all for attending today for our webinar on culturally responsive pedagogy through diversity discussions and diagnosis. And I know that Laura and I are super excited to share with you what is a study kind of in progress, and also some really important practices that we hope to share with you and hope to ask you to really think about when you are engaging with your students in the classroom. So with every good presentation or webinar, we have learning objectives. And so we'll have that slide here for you. We hope that you will gain some insight into culturally responsive pedagogy practice and application to teaching in a diagnosis course, and that you'll learn some teaching interventions designed to prepare counselors in training in culturally contextualized diagnostic practices. Lots of big words there. We need our students to be culturally proactive and responsive, right? So not just responding to what we're seeing, but how can we do this ahead of time? Participants, we hope, also will examine patterns in development related to multiculturalism and diagnostic practices, understanding, I think, the history and looking at some of our initial findings now within this study, hopefully will be something that is intriguing to you as well. And as we move forward with kind of the aims and purpose, really of how we engaged in this work, I want to talk a little bit about acknowledgement of our current issues contextually that are happening today, and in particular about race. And it's something that's present for many of us, and it can be triggering and jarring for many of us as we sit amidst jury selection for the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. So issues of diversity and equity and inclusion, anti-racism and anti-oppression are essential. They are not just essential because we work with clients or we teach students how to work with clients. They're essential because they are happening in society and continue to do so. So they're happening in the classroom, they're happening outside of the classroom, and we need to be mindful and aware of where we are in this space right now. And within this space, I just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge my own intersectional identity. I think this is an important piece when we're talking about diversity, because I have to sit here and also recognize my privilege in the spaces in which I enter. And we will dive into frameworks of this, right? The multicultural social justice counseling competencies a little bit later, and kind of how that plays a role within what we've done with this course, and the pedagogy in which it's influenced. But I recognize that my privilege as an educated individual, as somebody that has had the opportunity and access to be in leadership positions, in particular with the North Central ACES and ACES, and I recognize that privilege in my able-bodiedness, my access to technology, sitting here in the comfort of a office, being a cisgendered hetero female, and having that identity and recognizing that I have also, when you think about the framework of the multicultural social justice counseling competencies, has allowed me to jump social classes. I wasn't born into privilege at all, but as a Mexican American female, one of two that are within my college at all of faculty, and being a first generation college graduate, I didn't grow up in poverty in the sense of growing up in the projects, but I grew up 3 houses down. So I recognized the multiple worlds and the multiple intersections that we have as counselors, as counselor educators, and what that can do and what that influence can have on students when we work with students, for sure. And so when we think about and contextualize this aim and this purpose of this webinar, we really wanted to explore counseling student perceptions of diagnosis when it comes to things like race and culture and diverse populations. And we also wanted to look at our methods of teaching diagnosis in that culturally responsive pedagogy. And I know Laura is going to also talk about her intersectional identity as we continue to move forward as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Storlie. Absolutely. It is so crucial in these conversations to be present and aware of our own positionality. And so like Dr. Storlie, I come to this study, I came to this class really considering that intersectional piece of my identity, or intersectionality that I bring to the table, recognizing the privilege I bring as an able-bodied white cisgender individual coming into the space, recognizing the complexities of being a queer woman in a hetero-seeming relationship rather, and the complexities of that. Also the intersectionality in being an educated individual and being a doctoral student working with both a faculty member and with master's students, and the complexities of power in those sorts of situations. I think what became a theme in these discussions, and so something that I reflected on quite a bit throughout this process, is not only how our understanding and relationship with elements of our intersectional identity changes and adapts and it moves. It's a fluid relationship that we have with different aspects of ourselves, but how conversations like these can shed light or illuminate or enhance those different intersectional components throughout the community here. So then as we're talking about diagnosis, it's helpful to just think about, maybe even before we kind of look at the relationship between diversity and diagnosis, just to think about what a typical diagnosis class might look like and might experience. If you haven't taught a diagnosis class, if you have, these might be your experiences. These are things that Dr. Storlie and I have seen a couple iterations of teaching this course, that there's a lot coming into this course. There's a lot of feelings, there's a lot of misconceptions, there's a lot of hesitation, there's a lot of fear. And so I think there's really 3 kind of messages that I've observed coming up with some of these students. First is that I don't believe in diagnosis. Students coming in and they are confident, they are so passionate about wanting to avoid the diagnostic process, whether because they don't want to label clients or maybe because they don't believe in the diagnostic medical model of mental health. And so part of diagnosis class is unpacking that and talking about, okay, yes, maybe you don't believe in diagnosis of the process, but man, the system does. Man, you're working in a system that absolutely has diagnosis as a core part of it. What do we do? Similar, a lot of students feel like, I just don't want to. Like, I want to be the person separate from this process. Everybody else can diagnose, but I want to go do something different. And so part of these conversations then are, okay, well, what does that leave you in the field? Are you going to be in a private practice where you're only seeing clients who can pay out of pocket and you never have to worry about insurance? And similar, what happens for clients who maybe want a diagnosis, where that diagnosis would be really empowering and would give a name to something they've been facing for years and just didn't know how to describe it or what to call it. And then lastly, and I would argue that this third one might be the most common, is I'm afraid to diagnose. Man, the DSM is not a friendly book, right? It is so massive. It is so overwhelming at times. And so for students who have never encountered this process before, I think there's a lot of fear. And we hear it with students asking, am I doing this right? How do I do this? Questioning every bit of the process. Um, as I reflect on these, I point these as concerns, and I think Dr. Storlie and I are on the same page with this, not because we want to eliminate these concerns. I think this is part of that friction that as counselors we wrestle with the medical model versus our identity as counselors embodying that wellness approach. But these are really important contexts for this conversation that comes up around diversity and diagnosis, knowing that every student in these three attitudes lives somewhere in this capacity. It's also helpful to know that for the class where we ran this study, this is a online class, so it's different than a traditional course. It had a lot of asynchronous components, and then it had some online groups, which we'll talk a little more, but those are some of the contexts for this.
Yeah, I can say that diagnosis, and if I were to do this all over again already, traditional format, and again, if I could just make COVID go away, traditional format is always the way to go. I think you just get so much more in the classroom with students, and you get just kind of that universal feeling that these fears are okay, and let's walk through that together. Part of the next slides, and the next few slides, are really going to be some review of the literature, and some of this literature you may already be familiar with, but I think it's important to kind of give a context and a background in how we were engaging into some of the work that we were doing and kind of how we framed it. And so our own North Central ACES president, Dr. Kress, has written much about the lack of integration in cultural sensitivity and diagnosis, starting with DSM-4 TR and continuing forward, right? And so within the 2005 article, she provides real practical guidelines that counselors should consider when answering them, some questions they can ask themselves before diagnosing, to really facilitate some culturally responsive and sensitive practices. Danica Hayes and colleagues had a study of 41 counselors and indicated that cultural characteristics of both counselors and clients, including the degree of match between the characteristics, really affect the attention to cultural issues in clinical decision-making. So there was a significant relationship in this article, or in this study, excuse me, between participant cultural bias and a perceived level of client functioning. So within that article, the method was a little bit interesting. The participants were 41 counselors, and it was a mixed method study. And each one was given a case.
Oh, I think a participant may have their microphone on, so if everybody could mute for a moment, please. Okay, I might mute. Beautiful, thank you.
I did it. I grabbed
Perfect.
it. No
Okay.
problem. They were given one of six cases, and there was a narrative summary and an intake report. And the clients from the case studies had the same symptoms, but had a different cultural identity. So participants in the study diagnosed and pretended that the client diagnosed this pretend client and discussed the client's level of functioning over all the cultural attitudes, and the degree to which the cultural match happened between participant and counselor really significantly predicted whether the participant felt culture played a role in their case conceptualization. So with this, most of the participants felt like the cultural identities didn't influence case conceptualization or diagnosis at all. And so really studies like this really suggest that students aren't aware of how culture, their culture or the culture of their clients, affects their clinical decision-making. In the last bullet here on this slide, here we're talking about recognition. I think that diagnostic practices have been biased since the very beginning. As society took it upon himself to decide what was abnormal behavior, there has been inherent biases within these structures and a lack of cultural consideration overall within our diagnostic system. So let us also not forget, as I step onto my soapbox, that's slightly off topic, but related, no counselors were at the table for the DSM-5. When they were developing that, we did not have a seat or a say. So as we think about our own professional advocacy and professional identity, how do we get a seat at that table so that we too have that influence on what is the next iteration of the DSM, since, as Dr. Kress mentioned, I don't think it's going away. As we look to the next slide of kind of literature, we have a system, a mental health system that has a very troubling history in dehumanizing and oppressing our marginalized and minoritized individuals, especially in consideration of race and gender and cultural context. And so this cycle becomes more troubling when we think about the role of mental health diagnosis through history. In times when diagnosis was frequently weaponized to label societal unacceptable behaviors in mental illness. So now, even with the 5th edition, inequalities remain, as we mentioned before, and it suggests that the practice of diagnostic variance or individualized diagnostic judgment can be influenced by our cultural values and our biases, right? Our worldview comes in to whatever it is that we do. And so recognition of this is a very, very important thing for students to learn about. So like all of counseling, diagnosis can be a multicultural process, and it should be. And it needs to go beyond the cultural formulation interview, which is in DSM-5. So utilization of this, whether it's intentional or not, is really troubling when we think about from a systemic perspective. On a micro level, diagnosis can inform counseling treatment, and an incorrect diagnosis we know can lead to harmful treatment or harmful effects or ineffective treatment. And so within the counseling profession, our evidence-based practices are oftentimes studied among clients that have a shared diagnostic criteria to look at the efficacy of treatment. But diagnoses carry societal stigma due to stereotypes, and these stereotypes look different based on the racial, cultural group that you may lie in. And so within that, we have to know that our diagnoses are accurate, and there are strong impacts on the lives that we have when we are diagnosing our clients. So considering kind of all of these important cultural considerations, teaching from a culturally informed perspective is very critical. And so we sought to really look at some intentional focused groups and provide this platform for diversity discussions and diagnosis. And so we will Laura will speak a little bit more on the detail of the study as we keep moving forward. But one last slide, I think, of diagnosis in particular is that the facts remain. So racial and ethnic minority health disparities continue, and we have seen that now through COVID, right? In particular with Black and Latinx populations. They're disproportionately diagnosed with COVID. They're suffering more serious side effects than white individuals, and communities of color remain incessantly burdened with limited healthcare coverage. With this, we're also combining this intersectional identity with low income, engulfed in other racial injustices. And we already recognize and understand that racial disparities happen in healthcare and in mental health care, right? So now we have a pandemic upon us that continues to threaten the wellness of our clients and the wellness of our counselors, the wellness of our students. So this pattern of mistrust continues to affect BIPOC communities and can impact and create more barriers to help-seeking behavior. So our prior research here has really indicated that the use of diagnosis among various cultural groups creates the stigma. It also continues to show us that people of color and BIPOC communities are disproportionately diagnosed. So we have disproportionate levels of ADHD among African-American male youth in particular. We have conduct disorder with African-American men. We have women that are underdiagnosed with some learning disorders. We have misdiagnosis that happens with racial and ethnic minoritized youth. We have racial disparities with bipolar disorder and so forth. And so as we think about even the Latinx population, I know is three to four times as high as their white counterparts when we talk about psychotic disorder. So this ultimately brings us to teaching. Where are we with our teaching? Where are we with our pedagogy? The research that we've kind of just touched upon, just a very little in the last few minutes, just looks at the disparities that occur. And so what are we doing to make sure that we are culturally responsive and that we are proactive with our students? One of the things I can share from even putting together information when I first took over the diagnosis course here at Kent was making sure I had good videos, right? Good videos are a part of really showing what diagnosis symptomology can look like when we look at diagnostic criteria with students. And so there was some recommendations of using videos that of course reflect DSM-5. That was an important thing to do. New criteria as time went on, not so much new anymore. New when I kind of took it over. But with that, we had some videos through our library. And as I sought through them, there was a video of an African-American female that they had, how it was set up was an introduction to the case. Then the client themselves, which were discussing their diagnoses. And then they would have a clinical team, again, no counselors there, social work, psychologist, and 2 psychiatrists. And they would talk about the case that was presented. And in this particular one, we had an African-American female whose presentation was with bipolar disorder. And her symptoms reflected that. She talked about being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And as the clinical team talked about her case, they talked about whether or not she had fictitious disorder. And it made me want to pull out my hair because I thought, here again, here's a video I'm showing students. Here's a video that is helping prepare the next diagnosticians within our counseling profession. And now we're talking about not believing Black women. And so we have conversation about that and we discuss that. But again, these are videos made that are national videos to be accessed. And so how are we, again, looking at systemic injustices overall? How are we thinking about those things? So diversity and culture certainly expand beyond race and ethnicity. And we have definitely witnessed discriminatory practices in our society related to a variety of isms, right? That represent other or othering or otherness that affect oppressive populations, such as, but not limited to women, LGBTQ plus community, individuals that have visible or invisible disabilities, undocumented immigrants, the elderly, and other Indigenous populations. And so as counselors, and as we think about teaching our students, we have to move beyond simply understanding the current needs of diverse individuals. We have to engage in action-oriented interventions that address these injustices. So culturally responsive counseling leadership can extend this approach across our roles as counselors and our functions, right? Including advocacy and supervision and leadership. And we have a lot to do when it comes to combating systemic racism, things like bias-based bullying, both in our schools, in our agencies, within our profession, with our students, and with our society. So as we look at issues such as racism and prejudice and sexism and discrimination, oppression, microaggressions, heterosexism, poverty, those are just a couple of concepts that have perpetuated the inequities within our classes, our clients, and even ourselves as privileged members being able to listen to a webinar on a Wednesday afternoon. So this cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, cultural competence needs to become, those terms are very distinct and they have well-defined meanings, but they do offer a foundation for us to be culturally responsive if we can provide leadership in guiding some of our socially just practices within our future counselors, our future students. So moving on, there's just kind of a visual for you here that when we think about culturally responsive leadership, we think about culturally responsive pedagogy. It's enacted when professional counselors really do move beyond a mastery of just knowledge and they move to the action-oriented approach. And concurrently, they can engage in reflective evaluation for effective practices. and develop community and solidarity with marginalized groups. So how do we connect this with pedagogy? Again, how do we connect this with the classroom? How do we engage with students in and out of the classroom? Well, you think about Paulo Freire. So Paulo believed that education makes sense because individuals can learn through and make and remake themselves. So we can recognize that there are deficits and deficiencies within our system, but what are we doing? How are we taking responsibility? Because we have the capability of knowing. We also have to recognize, and this is very pedagogy of the oppressed, we have to recognize that we don't know what we don't know, right? And so that self-awareness, recognizing that you don't know what you don't know, also becomes important. Freire also argues that oppressed people can regain their humanity in the struggle for liberation, only if the struggle is led by oppressed people. So this introduces kind of a central issue or central problem. How do we create an education system or a pedagogy or a practice for working with those that are oppressed that will ultimately help them become more free? And part of that can become, how do we engage in our teaching? How we engage in our teaching, how we pass along this information to students, how they're able to absorb information and pass that on, helps with all of that when it comes to issues such as oppression. Okay, Laura.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Storlie. So now we're going to transition here to talk specifically about our study, our time with our students, to kind of inform and apply everything that Dr. Storlie has talked about. And I want to note too, I think we've talked a lot so far about the professional importance, about our own passion in this, about the need for these conversations in this setting. What I don't think we've mentioned is that the students also are calling for this. I remember I've taught diagnosis twice now, the latter time with Dr. Storlie for this study. And the first time, these conversations are coming up in the discussion boards. They're coming up in the activities and the reflections, like a desire and a want for these conversations. We had a huge number of volunteers for the study when we ran it. And I think that really reflects that this is a conversation not only happening these conversations are wanted not just by us as instructors, but by the students and the whole community as well. So we set this up so that we had students volunteer either for the study or for just class participation. And so we had 12 participants in the study portion. We did have one withdraw from the groups. She was very, very clear that it was not the groups, it was just the class wasn't fitting in her schedule. So that it ended with about 11 participants at the end. Of the clients or of the participants here, we had 4 cisgendered males, 8 cisgender females. We had 1 African-American student, 11 Caucasian students, and we had, I believe it was 6 students who identified as a member of the LGBTQ community, either reporting being as bisexual, pansexual, gay or lesbian. It's, of course, this is a pretty big limit. Right, that we have a pretty, we are lacking diversity in our participant pool here. And I think that speaks to not only some of the shortcomings of a study like this, but also just the shortcomings of our program, knowing that we recruited directly from our class and know that the class is directly representative of the program and the program is really representative of our field. I think that this speaks to larger questions of diversity and representation in counselor education as a whole. Does not impact the limits, or doesn't excuse rather the limits of our study, but is absolutely a symptom of it. We also want to note too, we did see students comfort with multiculturalism and diagnosis prior to coming into these focus groups. We had 4 students who had never had a multicultural class before. So they were taking diagnosis before multiculturalism, while the other 8 had already taken a multicultural counseling class. And 6, so right about half, had worked within a setting that diagnosed clients before. So although they had themselves not been diagnosing, they were at least, somewhat familiar with the diagnostic process and how it applies in the setting. And in terms of age, everybody, all were in their 20s but 2. So we had 10 participants in those early 20s range, and then a couple in their 30s. like I mentioned, we felt that this was a really crucial activity, so we offered opportunity to participate as a study or just for class credit, regardless. It was a 5-week class, so a crash course diagnosis course for sure, right? A lot of information in that time. And there were 4 designated discussion points following different topics that Dr. Storlie will talk about in a moment. Dr. Storlie and I took turns kind of facilitating. So she facilitated the class group, I facilitated the research group, and students knew that they could switch to a different group at any time. We had a couple who just due to time constraints switched either in and out of the group. Rather, they switched out of the research group. We also had a focus on applying the content from class materials, including the lectures, the DSM-5 videos that Dr. Storlie mentioned, materials on the actual process of diagnosing. And this was their time to process it and apply specifically diversity and multiculturalism to these concepts. This was also the primary meeting space for students. The course material was mainly asynchronous, so these were moments that they were able to process and kind of synthesize at a higher level than just reading through the DSM. In addition to this, they also had other assignments that kind of connected with those higher level skills. They did a diagnostic interview, they did a lot of cases. So we really tried to be intentional of being sure that they could practice and measure their skills in diagnosis and other capacities, and that this was really focused on diversity, right? This was really the space that they could synthesize and understand, and then be able to carry that with them into other aspects of the course. And our framework for this was the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies. What a great model. I'm sure you're here, you're part of this field. I think this is just a huge guiding force in our profession right now. And there are better people than I who have done a really thorough overview, but I'll mention what parts of this that we've used to inform our study. Specifically, the 4 areas. So how praxis develops and grows. This is really what guided how we conceptualize these focus groups. So if you are not familiar with this model, then you can recognize that multiculturalism and social justice lives on an intersectional axis based on privilege and marginalization and the client and counselor's role. So we, as Dr. Storlie mentioned, we started with a little bit of information on that for our students. And then we really had them focus first in that self-awareness piece, then focusing into that client worldview, extending into the counseling relationship, and the counseling and advocacy interventions. So our goal, this model really informed this because we wanted to really inhabit that idea that a culturally responsive diagnosis started with an internal self-awareness, that our job with these students was to help them become more aware of what this looks like, of their work, of their actions, their attitudes, so that then they could work to better understand clients' worldviews and how that intersected with diagnosis, and then so on and so forth. So we started internal and worked our way outwards. All right, and then handing it over to Dr. Storlie to talk about the questions here. Oh, and I see Dr. Storlie may have stepped out for a moment. So I'm wondering if she's having any internet issues. Could I ask for a quick thumbs up from a participant that they're able to hear me still? I want to make sure it's not internet. Thank you so much, Dr. Kress. So let me go ahead and talk to the topic formation, since this sort of segues into what we were discussing. And I know Dr. Storlie was having a couple internet concerns earlier, so I'm sure she'll be back in a moment. So it's helpful to know then if the model was what really inspired how we came about how we wanted to structure these focus groups, then we wanted to create questions and topic formation that really spoke to what this could look like moving forward. So for each week, we try to embody that model to help them reflect on the topic area, starting from that place of self-awareness, and then working outwards towards their towards more of the interventions and that advocacy piece. So for an example, within week 1, we had a topic of multiculturalism and history of assessment and mental health diagnosis. Welcome back, Dr. Storlie.
I apologize.
Yeah, no problem at all. I was just mentioning about the first topic here. So do you want me to?
Sure. No, I'll take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so what we tried to do is make sure that our alignment with the syllabus and the topics that were going to be for the group discussions and the focus groups were going to be aligned so that students felt like things were synchronous, I think, if anything. So week 2, we talked about racial and cultural disparities in severe and persistent mental illness. In week 3, we looked at culturally sensitive diagnostic practice within trauma and conduct disorders. And then week 4, we looked at culturally responsive and ethical practice in substance use and personality disorders. And so the questions that are aligned on the slide reflect similar to how we looked at each one. So for example, question 1, after listening to the lectures, reviewing the PowerPoints on the history of assessment and mental health diagnosis, describe how you are most self-aware of the significance of multiculturalism. And so that is also what we did with kind of infusing those words. So week 2, we would say, after listening to the lectures, reviewing the PowerPoint on racial and cultural disparities in severe and persistent mental illness, describe how you are most self-aware. So we try to use that consistent format throughout all of it.
Absolutely. And I just want to throw in there too, I think it was really important and key that we started with that history piece. So for the students who maybe came in a little skeptical, about like, why does this even matter? Which there were a couple. I think really starting with that history sensitive approach is what kind of paved that space that, no, this is a crucial conversation. We can look back and see how those threads are trickling forward even still.
Yeah. And moving on to the next slide, we also discussed, it's similar to kind of how we started today's webinar with talking kind of about our intersectional identity and our positions as facilitators. We offered that to the group as well. So our focus groups had the opportunity to share and talk about where they engaged in this work, where they were engaging in diversity work and who they were as intersectional beings, what they brought to the space to really kind of facilitate a sense of groundedness and I think mutual respect, and that we all come with a different worldview and that we need to recognize who we are and who is at this table to have these conversations. So as we had mentioned kind of earlier on, and maybe this is just a shameless plug for us, is that this is actually going to be a published study someday, and that we have gone through the data collection process. And so Laura will speak to you on some of the data analysis that's going on now. But really just we wanted to also make sure to emphasize our intentionality that we had behind the development of this and the reasons why, and how we can continue to practice and model some really good culturally sensitive and culturally responsive pedagogy in our practices.
Absolutely. So really, I think we're trying to be strategic about addressing this experience from 2 different angles. The first is what we're sharing with you all in conversation with you today on is, okay, this felt like it was important. Students were calling for it. What did they get? Like, what are their thoughts? What worked? What didn't? Like, how do we look at this really as a pedagogical tool? But then the second piece that is currently in the data analysis process now is focusing on themes in what master's level counselors in training consider and process in the role of diversity in diagnosis. Because this is a structured focus group, that gives us a really great opportunity to see how those interactive themes emerge, what happens in the actual focus groups, like in that process piece, and just seeing some of the themes coming up based on the different topics. So I agree with Dr. Storlie. This is a nice kind of shameless plug to stay tuned for part 2 of this. We're really excited to kind of continue to dig even further into this and share what we find with everybody. But we did, speaking to that more pedagogical area, we want to just focus on some of the group process that came up. The first of this is that there was student storming. Some of the group members or even self-reported that like, oh, this kind of feels like it has some of the therapeutic group qualities in some way. Not our intent. And of course, we, worked to ensure that this was a professionally safe space, not diving into personal mental health or anything like that. But because of the nature of this topic, there was absolutely storming. There was absolutely times when the group members felt like they weren't communicating. There was a disagreement. There was friction. There was somebody walking away feeling a little ugh about what happened, which is a really important note throughout this process.
Laura, I know also experienced some tension with her focus group, more of the research group, with tension and equity of people being vulnerable. And so some of the group members and participants had varying levels of comfort with sharing their identities and in their own multicultural development. So there was a range of students, as Laura had mentioned before, where some first semester, first class that they can take, to people that were coming back to get a different degree. So one that was out in the field already as a professional counselor and wanted to get another degree, so needed to take the diagnosis class. So we're talking about somebody that has graduated, is professional, to somebody that's just starting. And so there was a different level of comfort behind, a different level of presence, and I would say probably maturity with that comfort level of being open and talking about things such as positionality and talking about what it means to be a multicultural being, to talk about these very sensitive issues in connection to diagnosis. And I don't know if there was anything else, Laura, you might want to mention about that too.
I think you're absolutely right. Pointing to the developmental differences was a really intriguing part of this process. That I'll speak for myself, I didn't expect. And sometimes participants themselves were recognizing those developmental differences and using that language. So,
yeah. Right. So some of the barriers, definitely we can speak to as it is on a webinar, when your internet goes down, even when you're at the office, sometimes you just don't have this organic flow of conversation, right? That there is kind of the issue of you're muted, I can't hear you, right? We've all been in that, or our internet stops working. So I think that those situations, they're a part of our current environment. And I don't know that they're going to go away anytime soon, as much as we want them to. But in the unforeseeable future, that organic flow of conversation, when you have online groups or you have online classes, continues to be jeopardized. So some barriers there for sure.
Absolutely. And, I think we all have, as instructors, experienced the camera off situation where maybe there's a time we need those cameras on and a student is a little, they're not able to, or there's something happening. We didn't experience that in this group, but what was really interesting that occurred was some sidebar happening in the chat. By me simply not checking to close the chat box at the start of the group, this really, where it felt like maybe the most organic was in the chat conversation, where people were using reactions to either cheer or react in some way to what somebody was saying. So it is always interesting to see how that online format, it's a different language, right? To me, it felt like a different language than what this focus group would have looked like if it was 12 people sitting in chairs in a circle in a room. Also helpful context too, that I believe all the participants, except for the one that Dr. Storlie mentioned, who was coming back for a follow-up degree here, they had only taken online courses with the program at this point. They had not experienced any of the counseling program in person, which I think is different, right? That maybe they were more used to this. And we'll talk about that in a moment too, but maybe their tolerance or their reception to this process was a little different than somebody who was new to online classes.
I think also new, that relationship that you have with students that isn't in the classroom as well, right? And so that we see people down the hallway now that we didn't before because nothing was on campus. And so being able just to have dialogue and relationship afterwards can also help with comfort levels if you're going to be doing any type of group work at all. So go ahead.
Please go ahead. So what worked, right? I think that's kind of our question, is like, well, is this worth it? Did it feel like it was an impactful part of this? And we found there was some stuff that worked well and not so well. Some pieces that worked well, just to name maybe the first here, is that it felt fundamentally important to participants. So these are quotes directly from the participants. One who wrote, "This class would simply feel inadequate without addressing these specific issues." And I thought that really captured almost as a tagline of this experience, that for the students, it just felt like this was, like if this wasn't here, it would have been a missing piece for sure.
Yeah, and I think too, when you think about the microcosm of a classroom, right, and you think about group in and of itself and how you can kind of use those group dynamics within teaching, they're learning from one another. So one of the participants also stated it was an overall eye-opening experience learning about what diversity means to other grad students. Sometimes I wish they had lasted more than just an hour. Which I think is, I don't know, it's a really rewarding thing to know that people wanted to dig in further or deeper, or, you know, even more breadth of talking about these really, really important issues.
Absolutely. For one of the last big themes that came up in what worked well for participants is that it really continued to fuel their passion for multiculturalism. So many participants reflected and likely volunteered for the study because diversity was a passion of theirs. This is a big reason that they got into this field. So this one participant writes, "Having opportunity to share my views and hear others' views really fueled me and my passion. It was a highly positive experience because I believe people listen to one another and were able to grow in our perspectives regarding what it means to diagnose and consider mental health in relation to diversity and multiculturalism." So really speaking to how there was validation, there was celebration, there was community building, focusing on why this is important, where they were able to learn and inspire one another.
As we look at additional collective feedback from our participants, there's also things that did not go so great. And we mentioned the barriers, of course, earlier about the online piece. But with that online format, it does lead to challenges. So one of the participants mentioned, I got a little frustrated when good points got brought up, and it felt like there wasn't much conversation. Sometimes it just felt like everyone monologuing their points, but not much interchange. That can be hard to foster in a short period of time, though. So I think there was yet recognition that, you know, there's a limited time here. This is what we're trying to do from a research perspective, but some ownership that the group in and of itself should be doing a little bit more, and from a group perspective, not just from an individual's kind of sitting in a group.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then with that, kind of like we mentioned before with the developmental piece, clearly it was something that participants felt and are acknowledging that there were different levels of multicultural competency. So one participant writes, "To be 100% honest, it was a challenge for me to have these conversations with a group of peers who are not all at the same level of cultural competency. In my preparation for the discussions, I read research articles and honestly had more in-depth thoughts about questions than I thought I would. But when it was time for the conversations, it seemed like a good portion of my classmates were not thinking about things at the same level or took the topic in a completely different direction than what was originally intended." And it's helpful to know, I think part of missed expectations might just be a norm in all groups, right? That's something that is universal. But when we think about that developmental piece, that, this is a person who clearly wanted to go deeper than they felt that they could, then that shows that maybe that mismatch of the multicultural competency led to some of that friction in the group, or maybe just didn't allow for them to get as deep or all of what they wanted from the actual group experience.
So some considerations and just conversation points that we'd love to open up to the group. Certainly, we'd love to hear your overall feedback and thoughts about this kind of teaching intervention that we did, but even some conversation about counselor development or differences in student participants, the placement maybe of your diagnosis course within your curriculum, the demographic composition of student population and participants. So again, it was very reflective, I would say, of Kent State, of a predominantly white university. And a participant stating, "This felt like another multicultural class. Why do we do this again?" So I don't know, Laura, would you like to, is now a good time to open this up for the group, or any other comments that you wanted to share before we do that?
No, I think I would definitely love to hear thoughts, either unmuting and sharing, or maybe via chat. That might be easier.
Sure. Yeah.
Great.
Either way.
Hi, this is Judy. I think the question, why do this again? It sounds like multicultural ed, the multicultural class. I think I remember research in working with special issues with students in the schools. I train school counselors. I remember that the research shows the more that you can do something once, like a convocation per se, and it has an effect, but not as much effect as having the same issue brought up routinely. So having it interjected in many classes is a good thing because it'll be retained better.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Judy. I appreciate that. I do feel like if we are repetitive on some things and that's okay. We want to make sure the point gets across for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I really, I remember when the student said that, I initially felt kind of startled, like, oh my goodness. But then thinking about the developmental piece, about how for students who had already taken multicultural counseling, maybe this was a chance to go deeper. Maybe this is kind of a primer for those who haven't taken multicultural counseling. So thank you so much, Judy. That repetition is so key.
Hi, Cassie.
Hi, Carol.
This is Carol up in La Crosse. I love this idea of how you put these focus groups together to kind of really focus on this topic. I have felt that when I teach the diagnosis and treatment planning class here, that there's just so much to get in, that this is a real thing that you have to be super intentional about. And it's something that I've been really very intentional about. I have a kind of a bit of an advantage because in our diagnosis and treatment planning class, it's a middle course. So they have taken their basic theories, they've taken their multicultural, they've taken some of our early courses, and then this is one of our middle courses. And we have infused these topics throughout our curriculum, and very intentionally infused it throughout our curriculum in every class we teach. And so when we hit topics like this, they are able to start to put some of those connections together when they've talked about multicultural issues in family and couple counseling, when we've hit this with diagnosis, when we've done trauma and crisis counseling. And so for us, it's kind of a thing, but I really liked the intentionality with these focus groups and how you did that within this class. I think it's a great takeaway. And I thought it was wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks, Carol. Here at Kent, our diagnosis course, typically what we have it is pre-practicum, so before they enter practicum. And I think one of the rationale, I guess, behind that is that so it's open, they don't have any prereqs for that, is that we have rolling admissions. And so when we don't have that cohort to be able to really provide that structure, we end up really providing almost every course every semester. And so I would say one of the drawbacks of that is that a first semester student that wants to start taking classes right away in the summer can take this, but they have no experience whatsoever. They might be concurrently taking their orientation class with it, but still, as we know, with orientation, sometimes that's just so early. And so then to get this, so I think there's probably pros and cons to that, right? I mean, there's some pros to say, yeah, we're going to start and we're going to hit heavy now on these diversity discussions. And there's also that drawback that can happen without really having a good understanding of the profession itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge, thank you, Amy, for what you said in the chat here. I really appreciate seeing this kind of set up so that similar, that multicultural class can kind of inform the diagnosis course, and then how to pull those considerations into other courses as well. I think that's what, at least I know I think Dr. Storlie in our conversations kind of walked away from is, man, wouldn't it be cool to have a version of this kind of thing in every course, similar to what you're saying, Carol, to be able to have that intentionality so that there's no question in any topic for any student on how they repeat and build those skills. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, both of you. I'm aware of the time. Thank you so much for your presentation. I actually have a Pearson book on diagnosis and treatment related to it's a diagnosis and treatment book, just kind of a general book. And I know I have a chapter in there on multicultural and ethics issues. And one of my challenges is always, how do we do more? How do I do more in my book, right? To promote these conversations, particularly once you get into the treatment chapters. So if any of you have thoughts on that, or ever want to reach out and geek out and have conversations about that, I would love to talk to any of you about it, because I think it is so important. So I'm aware of the time. I know it's already after 1, and I think the kind of the structure is our presenters will hang out here for another 5 or 10 minutes to see if you guys have any things that you want to touch base on or any additional comments. And as a reminder, we'll be sending you the CE form. You have to fill out the evaluation of the session, and then we will be following up with the CE certificate. If you haven't, like I said, please go to our website and register for some of our other presentations. And I would also like to thank all of you again personally for being here and for making space during this really busy time of the year to be here and to have this conversation with all of us. And I'd like to thank our presenters for such a thought-provoking and important, very important conversation and presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely open to stick around
Great.
for questions, but thank you for joining, everybody. Then I'll go ahead and stop sharing if that works.
I was just thanking you guys so much again for doing the presentation. Such an important topic.
Absolutely. Laura, I think mine's still recording.
Oh yeah, let me stop. Thank you.
I was